Ron Johnson arrived at the hearing room that Tuesday morning the way he always arrived, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once considered that the room might not belong to him. He had been a United States Senator from Wisconsin for 15 years by then, a former plastics manufacturer who had leveraged a single-wave election into what had become, for him, a permanent address in American power, and he carried the tenure in his posture, in the angle of his chin, in the way he moved through doorways as though they had been built specifically to receive him. His aide had briefed him on the morning's agenda during the elevator ride up from the garage. A Senate subcommittee session on federal contracting accountability and veterans benefit disbursement, routine oversight work, the kind of hearing that senior members attended long enough to make their presence felt and then delegated to staff. He did not notice the folders at first. They were arranged at the far end of the witness table with a kind of institutional neatness that read, at a distance, as ordinary preparation. 5 of them, color-coded with printed tabs, each one weighted with paper. He registered the woman behind them a moment later. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas was sitting with her hands folded on top of a yellow legal pad, not reviewing notes, not conferring with her staff, not performing the pre-session choreography that most members use to signal their importance. She was simply sitting, watching the room with the particular stillness of someone who has already finished every piece of preparation that needed to be done and is now simply waiting for the clock to move forward. Johnson looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already categorized. He turned to his chief of staff and said something low and brief. Both men smiled. The microphones above the dais were not yet live. The cameras had been recording for 4 minutes. When the session was formally called to order, Johnson settled into his chair with the ease of a man at a table he considered his own. He had appeared before more committees than he could count in either direction. He had sat through select committee scrutiny following January 6th. He had navigated a re-election cycle in which the full institutional weight of one party had tried to remove him from office. He was still here. He had a theory about men like himself, and it was that Washington had a way of sorting things out in their favor if they were patient enough to let it. He looked across the table one more time at Crockett. She was writing something on the legal pad, one line. She underlined it. Then she set the pen down and folded her hands again. Johnson registered none of this as warning. He registered it, if anything, as confirmation. He opened with the authority of a man who intends to control the room before the room has finished settling. He had come prepared to address the committee's stated agenda, federal contracting irregularities, and his opening statement moved efficiently through the terrain he knew best: government waste, bureaucratic expansion, the difficulty of genuine accountability in an apparatus too large for any single hearing to interrogate meaningfully. He used the word woke in reference to legislative priorities he characterized as performative. He suggested that certain members of Congress were more committed to the theater of oversight than to its substance, and he did not look at Crockett when he said it because he did not need to. He let the implication do the work. He referenced his 15 years in the Senate as context for why his analysis of federal contracting deserved particular weight. He had run a business before coming to Washington, he reminded the room. He had signed payroll. He had managed vendor relationships. He understood accountability not as an abstraction constructed in legislative chambers, but as a practical discipline enforced by market consequences. That was a perspective, he suggested, that not every member present could claim. He paused in the way that skilled orators pause, long enough for agreement to fill the silence, not long enough to invite interruption. He moved then to what he characterized as his own record on veterans' issues, a record he was, he said, proud to defend. He had consistently voted to protect essential programs. He had consistently supported the foundational commitments that American veterans had earned through their service. If some members of this committee had a different characterization of that record, he would be happy to address specific distortions. But he would not sit here and allow an incomplete accounting to stand unchallenged. He straightened his jacket and waited. Crockett wrote one more line on the legal pad. She did not look up. She drew a small box around it and set the pen down with the quiet precision of someone completing the last item on a list. When it was her turn, she did not raise her voice. She thanked the senator for his remarks and said she was glad he had raised the subject of his record, because she had been hoping to discuss that record specifically, and she had some questions she believed he could help her clarify. Her tone was not warm and it was not hostile. It was the tone of a woman who has organized 11 weeks of preparation into 5 color-coded folders and has arrived at the moment when that preparation becomes useful. She placed her hand flat on top of the first folder. She left it there for 2 full seconds before she spoke again. She said she appreciated that the senator had described himself as a consistent champion of veterans' benefits. She said that framing was going to serve as useful context for everything that came next. She slid the first folder to the center of the table, opened it to a section marked with a yellow tab, and turned it so that the cameras on her left could read the cover page clearly. She did not announce what it contained. She said, "Let's begin here." The first document was the official roll call record from August of 2022. The bill in question was the Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson Honoring Our Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxics Act, the PACT Act, federal legislation designed to extend healthcare eligibility and benefits to veterans who had suffered documented toxic exposure from open burn pits operated during military service in Iraq and Afghanistan. Crockett read the bill's formal purpose statement in full. She read it without abbreviation. Then she read the vote count. Then she read Senator Johnson's name from the record, listed under those who had voted against advancing the bill. She noted that he had done so not once but on 2 separate procedural votes within the same legislative window, the second coming 5 days after the first, when the Senate had attempted to bring the bill back to the floor. She looked up. She asked him if that voting record was accurate. Senator Johnson said that the situation was considerably more complicated than a yes or no answer could adequately capture. He said there had been legitimate and serious concerns regarding the bill's budgetary classification. Concerns about whether burn pit funding should be designated as mandatory spending or discretionary, concerns that went to the structural integrity of the federal budget and not to any animus toward veterans themselves. He said he supported veterans. He had always supported veterans. The procedural votes had been about process, not about the people the bill was designed to serve. He said that distinction mattered. Crockett said she understood the distinction. She said she would come back to the budget classification question very shortly because she had something specific to show him on that precise point. She opened the second folder. The second document was a Congressional Budget Office analysis. It had been produced 3 weeks before Johnson's first procedural block. It had been requested in writing by Senator Johnson's own office. The CBO analysis had concluded that the budgetary concerns Johnson would subsequently cite publicly, the mandatory versus discretionary classification question, had already been resolved by a bipartisan amendment that passed before the bill reached its final procedural vote. Johnson's office had received the completed analysis. The receipt timestamp was printed in the lower left corner of the transmittal cover. Crockett set her finger beside it and held the document toward the nearest camera without breaking her conversational posture. She then placed 2 additional documents beside the first, the second and third independent budget analyses, both commissioned through separate committees, both reaching the same structural conclusion. She aligned all 3 in a row and did not say what they proved. She let the dates and the recipient stamps do that work for her. 10 seconds passed. Senator Johnson looked at the documents. He looked at his chief of staff. He looked back at the documents. He said that budget office analyses were advisory instruments, not binding determinations, and that responsible legislators weighed multiple inputs before reaching procedural decisions. Crockett said she understood. She said she simply wanted to ensure the record reflected that the budget concern he had cited publicly as his stated reason for the vote had been formally addressed before the vote occurred. She moved forward. The third document had not come from a government agency. It had come from Senator Johnson's own website. It was an archived page, timestamped June 2021 by the Internet Archive's public database, on which his office had published a statement declaring his unequivocal support for legislation addressing toxic burn pit exposure and his personal commitment to ensuring that veterans receive the health care benefits they had earned through their service. Crockett read the statement without editorial comment. She read the byline. She set the document down and waited. He said that legislative positions were refined as bill language developed. He said that was a normal and responsible part of the process. He said he was not going to apologize for due diligence. She said she was glad he had raised the question of legislative language, because that was the next document she wanted to review. She opened folder 3. The document inside was a side-by-side statutory comparison. On the left, the full text of a 2021 piece of legislation that Johnson had co-sponsored voluntarily, adding his name to a bill extending expanded healthcare access to veterans of the Gulf War era. On the right, the substantively parallel sections of the PACT Act addressing eligibility criteria and benefit disbursement mechanisms. The 2 bills shared nearly identical statutory language in every section that Johnson had cited as problematic. Crockett gave the room a moment with the comparison. Then she asked Senator Johnson to identify, specifically, the substantive legal distinction between the bill he had co-sponsored and the bill he had twice blocked. 15 seconds. 20. He reached for a glass of water. He said the two bills were structurally different in ways that the side-by-side format could not adequately represent without fuller context. He said he would be pleased to provide that context in a written submission following the conclusion of the hearing. Crockett said she would look forward to receiving it. She continued, "The fourth document was a certified transcript, bearing the seal of the Senate Finance Committee and a notarized date of January 2023. From a closed-door session in which Senator Johnson had been asked directly whether he believed Social Security and Medicare should be subject to annual congressional appropriations rather than existing as protected mandatory expenditures. His answer, in his own words, in his own voice, under the seal of that committee, read as follows: "I have consistently said that no federal program should be immune from the discipline of annual budgetary review, none. That includes Social Security and Medicare. If we are serious about fiscal responsibility, those programs have to be on the table like everything else." Crockett read the statement in its entirety. She read it at the same pace she had read every other document. She confirmed the transcript's date, its committee of origin, and the name printed at the top of the page. She set it down. She placed beside it an actuarial analysis commissioned by the Senate Budget Committee, estimating the downstream impact on current beneficiaries if Social Security were reclassified from mandatory to discretionary status. The headline number on the summary page was 67 million. That was the total number of Americans whose retirement security depended on Social Security benefits continuing at their current protected level. Of that 67 million, 1 million were veterans or surviving spouses of veterans. The figure appeared on line 14 of the executive summary. Crockett put her finger on line 14 and asked Senator Johnson whether he could explain, in light of the two procedural votes blocking the PACT Act and the Finance Committee statement now in evidence, why veterans' retirement security should be placed on the annual congressional negotiating table at the same time that veterans' health care legislation was being held at the procedural gate. The silence that followed was not polite. It was not transitional. 5 seconds passed. 10. At 14 seconds, a pen rolled off the edge of a staffer's notebook somewhere to the left of the dais and struck the floor, and the sound of it was the loudest thing in the room. 20 seconds, 25. Senator Johnson opened his mouth once. What came out was not language. He tried again. He said the quote had been removed from context. She said she had the full surrounding transcript and asked whether he would like her to read it. He said that would not be necessary. She said she believed it would be. She read it. The surrounding paragraphs clarified the statement rather than qualifying it. She paused then. She set the transcript down, and she said there was someone else in the room who had asked to speak, and that she believed the committee owed him the time. His name was David Baca. He was 53 years old. He lived in Racine, Wisconsin, Senator Johnson's home state. He had served 2 tours in Iraq, the second as a logistics coordinator overseeing supply operations at a forward operating base outside Fallujah. For 14 months he had worked within operational range of open burn pits. He came home in 2010 coughing. By 2019 he had a diagnosis, a progressive form of pulmonary fibrosis that the Veterans Administration had only recently begun formally linking to burn pit exposure in its claims guidance. He had applied for expanded benefits under the pre-PACT regulatory framework. He had been denied. He had appealed. He had been denied again. He had followed the PACT Act through Congress with the specific attention of a man whose life depended on the outcome. He had watched the procedural votes. He had found Senator Johnson's name in the record. He said all of this without anger. He said it the way a man delivers a prepared statement he has rehearsed, not for performance but for precision because he needs to say it correctly, and he does not know how many chances he will get. He said that by the time the PACT Act was signed into law, he had already spent 11 months pursuing a benefits appeal that the act would have resolved in a matter of weeks. He said his daughter, who had been 14 during that period, had watched him schedule medical appointments around medication costs his denied benefits would have covered. He said he was not there to ask for an apology. He was there to ask that the cost be acknowledged, in this room, on this record, by the people who had the authority to have made a different choice. He folded his hands in his lap when he finished and looked directly at Senator Johnson for a long moment before looking away at nothing in particular. Senator Johnson looked at the table. It was after David Baca had spoken and the room had absorbed the silence following his testimony that Johnson made his first serious error in judgment. He had held himself together through the documents. He had sustained, if not credibility, then at least the appearance of composure. And then he said the thing that unraveled it. He said that he respected the man's service and was sorry for what he had experienced. And then he said that the PACT Act's legislative timeline had not been about veterans. It had been about responsible governing. He said that legislators who understood budget architecture were doing veterans no favors by passing poorly structured legislation on emotional timelines. He said that anyone who had read the bill's full language would understand that. Jasmine Crockett picked up her pen. She looked at the senator for a moment with an expression that had no anger in it and no contempt, only the focused attention of a woman arriving at the final phase of something she had been building for a long time. She said she had one more folder. She opened it. The document on top was a Senate Ethics Committee financial disclosure filing, the annual form required of all sitting senators, a matter of public record. On page 7, under Investments and Financial Interests, was a line item for a private equity fund. The fund was described in broad terms in the disclosure, but paperclipped to the cover was a regulatory filing obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, a Securities and Exchange Commission document identifying the fund's portfolio holdings. The fund held a controlling interest in a defense logistics subcontracting firm. That firm had held continuously renewed federal contracts for the operational management of burn pit infrastructure at forward operating bases in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2006 through 2019. Crockett placed both documents on the table without speaking. She left them there. She watched the room read. Senator Johnson's hands moved from the table's surface to its edge. His chief of staff leaned toward him. Johnson did not respond. The color that had entered his face during David Baca's testimony moved into something past red, and his jaw worked without producing sound for a moment before he gathered himself. He said that the investment had been disclosed in the required filing, which was a matter of public record, which anyone in the room could review, and that the insinuation embedded in how those documents had been sequenced together was a partisan smear without evidentiary foundation. His voice had moved up half a register. His delivery had lost the measured cadence of his opening statement. He was speaking faster now, and the speed was visible. Crockett let him finish. She waited a full 3 seconds after he stopped. Then she asked him the question. She asked it quietly, without inflection, as one asks a question whose purpose is not information but reckoning. Given the disclosed financial interest in a contractor whose operations were directly implicated in the healthcare outcomes the PACT Act was designed to address, and given the 2 procedural votes blocking that legislation, could he explain to David Baca, who was seated 12 feet to his left and was listening, why the sequence was a coincidence? 23 seconds. She had counted them in her preparation. She counted them again now. The cameras did not move. A stenographer's hands, which had been moving continuously for 2 hours, went still. Senator Johnson's mouth opened at the 8-second mark. His chief of staff put a hand on his forearm at the 15-second mark. At 20 seconds, 3 words came out, separated and barely connected. "I have nothing." And then the sentence stopped. It did not conclude, it simply stopped, as if the remainder of it had gone somewhere he could not reach. She did not pause to absorb it. She closed the final folder with the same quiet efficiency with which she had opened the first. She squared the stack. She looked at the single line on her legal pad and the line she had written and underlined at the very beginning of the hearing before a word had been spoken. And she spoke her closing statement to the room, not to the senator. She said she had not come to embarrass anyone. She said she had come because a man from Racine, Wisconsin, had served his country, had come home carrying a disease acquired in that service, and had spent 11 months fighting for benefits he had already earned while a senator from his own state, a senator who held a disclosed financial interest in the industry whose operations had contributed to that disease, had used procedural arguments to delay those benefits. She said that was not a partisan characterization. It was a documented sequence, and every document was available to anyone in the room through the public record. She said that accountability was not a partisan instrument. It was the function this committee existed to perform, and it required asking uncomfortable questions of people with the authority to have made different choices. She paused. She looked at the stack of folders. She looked at Senator Johnson. She said she found it worth noting, and she asked the committee to find it worth noting, that the senator who had walked into this room and suggested in terms that did not require interpretation that a congresswoman with a law degree and a decade of civil rights litigation behind her lacked the standing for serious legislative work was the same senator who had just been unable to provide a single documented response to questions about his own voting record. She said she hoped the record would reflect that. She said she had no further questions. She gathered her folders, stood, and left the room without ceremony, without theater, and without a single wasted word.